God, you declare your almighty power chiefly in showing mercy and pity. This doesn't sound much like the type of power that we are used to, does it? Power that's shown through mercy and pity. But yet there it is, right at the opening of our collect for today. It's teasing us with this enticing kind of flipped image of strength that seems to be rooted in not power over, but caring and compassion. It seems so foreign to us. I mean, imagine if we could be like this too. A world where people are connected through love and compassion, helping each other in our struggles. A world where people think of other people's needs first. A world where resources, whether abundant or scarce, are used in a life-giving spirit of healing and of sharing. A world where everything starts from the question, are any among you suffering? It would be nice, but as we think it through, it doesn't feel like we live in that world, does it? I mean, we live in the world of superpowers and the global economy of a competitive marketplace, and the bottom line, layoffs, shutdowns, pandemic, and economic uncertainty. How could we live the way we just imagined and still survive? I mean, is there anyone out there who has a workplace where you feel like you can just walk in for a normal day of work or log on to Zoom and then make all of your decisions based upon helping those who are suffering the most? I mean, how many would still have a job if they did that at the end of the day? I know a few of you might be in that position, but I'm guessing it's not many of us. I mean, this is California. It's one of the most powerful economies in the world, and we didn't get there by not being a bit competitive. We're not some ancient fishing village. Right now, as the COVID-19 pandemic and its ensuing civic chaos just drags on, it's especially hard, I think, to feel optimistic about a world, a country, or even a little local community where strength and resources and leadership and talents are focused on resolving common problems with healing and the alleviation of suffering at the forefront of our goals. Instead, I think we all too often find ourselves and our communities at our worst. I mean, it's just all this complaining and squabbling over everything that we think that we don't have and everything that we think is going wrong. I mean, among all of that media mudslinging, it is hard for us to remember that we live in the most affluent, prosperous, and resource-rich nation probably of all time. And you know what? I think it's really easy for us to get discouraged, to lose faith, not just in our current set of leaders, but to lose faith even in the possibility that there could be any sort of human leader that we could get behind in this way. I mean, we're finding it too audacious of a leap of faith, that there could be some sort of human leader that uses power in emulation of God's compassion. Which is what brings us today to the Book of Esther. Now, we, as so often happens, get dropped right in near the end of this story today. Is there anyone here who knows the whole story? A couple of you. Oh, good. I'm glad. And I see a couple in our online community too. That's great. I had to go back and remind myself. I mean, as I read through, I realized if ever there was a book in the Bible about all of that bad stuff that we were just talking about being all that we can see at work in the world. Well, this is the one. There's foreign exile, there's anti-Semitism, there's intrigue, power plays, murder, genocide. I mean, you name it. King Ahasuerus' Persian kingdom, it is not a model of God's mercy and pity. In fact, they are so far from this reality that what is in there is this kind of ironic reversal. It's that flipping of the scales so that the mighty fall and the powers are raised up that we heard from that opening line from our collect as characteristic of how God acts in the world. I mean, Esther may be queen, but she still has to hide the fact that she's Jewish. She was an orphan, and she only became queen because it was chosen as the most beautiful woman in all of the land. And one of those, the fairy tale style beauty parades where the king gets to choose their new bride. And one of the stories we skipped is that he actually executed his previous wife, which is why he's in need of a new one to begin with. Well, be that as it may, Esther has the king's ear. And so she is able to tell him about a plot against his rule that her uncle Mordecai overheard when he was hanging out at the city gate. But the king's right-hand man, Haman, well, he is arrogant and power hungry. I mean, you know the type. When Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, Haman decrees not only that Mordecai should be punished, he decrees that Mordecai should be hung, but also he decrees that all of the Jews in the kingdom be killed. And he rolls a set of dice so he can pick the date. I mean, I know this sounds like a lot of hyperbole, but it's emphasizing for us all of that random cruelness of the world and all of the ways that power is used arbitrarily to hurt and harm the most vulnerable out there. But as we see today, Esther somehow figures out a way to flip this awful situation so that the Jewish people are delivered and Haman is the one that is hung instead of Mordecai. It feels like a sort of justice. And this is the origin of the Jewish festival of Purim, which we heard described there. It's not a happy story for the most part. You got to get to the ending to get to that. Even though there's deliverance, it's still full of that whole sense of how harsh life can be and how distant God feels in the middle of all of it. We're the readers, and we are left to interpolate all of the ways that God's hand is at work here. That's why the Jewish people have to make jokes to deal with it. I read that Purim is traditionally celebrated with humor. In synagogues, the story of Esther is often retold through funny sort of joke or spiel songs and skits with people booing after Haman and hissing and cheering whenever Mordecai steps on the stage. It kind of sounds to me a bit like the British tradition of the Christmas panto, which I don't know if any of you ever saw when they used to do them at UCSC, but they have that sort of sense of melodrama and engagement by the audience. One of the other things that they do apparently is that they tell Purim jokes. Now I did a quick Google and here's some of my favorite ones that I found. I have to warn you, these are really, really goofy jokes. They're going full out here. Waiter, waiter, I'm in a hurry. Will my matzo be long? No, sir. It will be square. Oh. Gets better. Why do we give out so much charity on Purim? Well, the Megillah says that this holiday is called Purim because of the pur, which is the lots or dice that Haman threw. Therefore, we give out lots to the poor. Oh. That's right. Okay, here's the worst. This is my favorite. What was Queen Esther's royal gown made out of? Polyester. All right, that was our humor break. The point of all of this humor is that even when it feels like God is absent and the world is so messed up that we have to either laugh or we're going to cry, we have not been left to struggle on our own. God's actually right there underneath all of it, busy reversing those scales, overturning all of those dastardly schemes of the powerful. God is also with us, giving us whatever we need, just like God gave Esther and Mordecai and all the people in this book of the Bible what they needed to get through it. God gives each and every one of us what we need too. God's made one of us a prophet, a healer, another a teacher, so on, so that we each have a role to play. So centuries later, Jesus' disciples, they're still not quite sure about all of this. I mean, it seems today as we read about them that they think that God's mercy is this scarce commodity and that they want to be in control of handing out its spoils. After all, Jesus called them personally. They've paid their dues and they have dropped everything to follow. So why should this random stranger be able to cast out demons in Jesus' name when they couldn't? Because a few verses earlier, we hear that they are actually trying and they haven't been given this gift yet. But the disciples have been given something else. They've been given the incredible blessing of being with Jesus day in and day out. Yet all that they can see in this moment is what they don't have. They want to keep Jesus and his power and his blessings all to themselves. Jesus is trying to tell them this thing, it's so much bigger than just the 12 of you. My being with you, all my power and healing, it's all from God. And God's power and goodness, well, it's unlimited. Jesus reminds them that God will share these blessings with anyone who will accept them. Anyone who is not against God is with God. And God is with them, working in them whether they know it or not. That's the gospel. That is the good news. Now, Jesus uses some pretty strong hyperbole to make his point that if they waste their time trying to keep down the spirit at work all around them, and if they fail to use the gifts that they've been given in the way that they've been called into service of others, then they too will be against God. Now, I'm most comfortable with the image of the unsalty salt. It's easier for me than some of the other ones that we heard today, but it took me a while to figure it out. Because, for us, salt is actually kind of sinful, right? Like watch your salt, it's a little too salty, be careful. But in Jesus's time, salt was life-giving. It wasn't just, oops, try that again. Ta-da. I get too animated up here, sorry. In Jesus's time, salt was not just a flavor enhancer. It was there to keep food from going rotten. Because in a world without refrigeration, that's critical for survival. Salt was also critical to one's relationship with God. If you check in Leviticus, you'll discover that salt is a required part of all incense and every sacrifice, because it kept out the agents of decay and it kept the sacrifices and incense pure and fit to offer to God in the temple. Jesus's point is that salt is really important because salt lends its power and goodness to other things, not to itself. On its own, salt actually tastes terrible in too high of a concentration. In fact, it can poison land and water. And if you leave it sitting around, it gets contaminated with sand or dirt, and then it's useless. That's the model of life that Jesus is giving to his disciples and to the early church and to each and every one of us. Why do you think it's so hard for people to live in the world like salt? In fact, most of the world, if we look around, I think what we're seeing is unsalty salt, right? Well, I would be willing to bet that you can come up with a huge list of all the things that overwhelm us and other people around us and make us say that we just can't do it that way. We can't care with that overwhelming mercy and pity the way God cares for us all the time. It's hard for us to keep asking that question, who among us is suffering? And then mobilizing our resources to alleviate that suffering. But sometimes I think it just all comes down to letting fear shut out God's presence in our lives and in our world so that we feel and think that God is actually absent. I think this is what Esther and Jesus and James are all saying to us. God's kingdom, it is breaking out among us if we just look around us. And we are not in this alone. God is with us, working in us so that we can also be people whose lives and loves and sharing and caring is done just the way God has done it for us. I mean, imagine a community where no one suffers alone. And if someone is sick, word is sent out so that everyone can pray for them. They're honest about their shortcomings. They give each other counsel and forgiveness. And if one of them is in trouble, they're not abandoned. This is the type of community that the author of the letter of James is calling upon his early church to be. Imagine a church where people come together to worship and serve God, and God has blessed them generously, and they give generously of their resources and skills. They study and they pray and they minister together. They care for the sick and the hungry among them. They support each other in their faith journeys, and they reach beyond their walls to serve people in need in their neighborhood and in their world. And they welcome anyone who comes through their doors with the blessings that they've received. See, that's not a church of the imagination or some faraway country or the distant past. That's St. Philip's. That's who we are, all of us together at our very best, using all of those gifts and resources that God has given us and turning around and making them the abundance of all. Because at our best, we are salty people. So as we enter the season, when what we've planted is starting to bear fruit, I invite you all to ask yourself, what is my particular type of saltiness, and how do I season this little corner of the unfolding kingdom of God? Then I challenge you to find that same generosity of spirit that God shows us and to keep on giving abundantly out of that deep, deep well of God's mercy and compassion. Give that way in the church, in this community, and in this world. Amen.